And welcome to this edition of The Scene Show. Great to be with you here on a Monday afternoon, the Monday after the Feast of the Epiphany in the United States. And we are rolling through the Christmas season with the baptism of the Lord being this coming Sunday, and that will mark the end of the Christmas season in the church, and then we'll go into ordinary time, and then we will eventually be hitting Lent here before we know it. In the beginning of March. But today we're talking about the 3rd century and what can often be called the African century of Christian thought. And we'll talk about the two schools that developed there, and then we'll talk about the 4 major thinkers, and then we'll roll it all together in Christianity getting its act together and coming to a universal agreement on the Creed and the canon of the New Testament and the canon of the Old Testament. We'll talk about those and what it means for the history of the church, and really try and draw some contemporary application of this history that we are looking at. So don't go away, you won't want to miss it here, and we'll get into it right after this quick break. Don't go away. And we 3 kings of Orient are on this Epiphany edition of the Scene Show. Now, I mentioned at the top of the show that the 3rd century can be called the African century of Christian thought, and that's because it focuses around 2 North African cities, Carthage and Alexandria. And I just want to say a little bit to say a little bit about Carthage and Alexandria. So you have Alexandria as really the melting pot of the region and the empire, because it's very much a culturally diverse and intellectually curious place. There's, think pluralism, when there being a lot of different worldviews and beliefs surrounding the same area. And as a result, the Christianity there develops this sort of speculative edge, really through the use of Greek philosophy. So we again see this history where philosophy becomes important to theology or theological reflection. And then you have Carthage, which by contrast is much more pragmatic, much more practical in its approach. And that could be because of the Stoicism there, that could be because of the rich tradition of law and civic virtue and commerce there. And so because of that, Christianity there, or Christians there, they're concerned with developing really a sound system, really kind of a systematic theology that can weather the persecution of the empire. And that's going to be a major thing in the background here, is the persecution of Christians, because it really reaches its height under the Emperor Diocletian in this century. Now, the major thinkers, we have four of them. We have from Carthage, Tertullian, and Cyprian. And then from Alexandria, we have Clement and Origen. Now, they really, where they differ is that again, the school at Carthage and the school at Alexandria, they will take differing approaches in the role of philosophy in their speculation. And so we see Clement and Tertullian being, we'll start with those two because they're contemporaries of one another. And Clement seeks to incorporate philosophy with theology when possible. And Tertullian, by contrast, rejects much of the philosophical speculation and tries to go for a more purely biblical and a more Judeo-Christian, if you will, speculation rather than Clement. Now, one of the things that I thought was interesting about the way that Roger Olson presents these two is he presents Tertullian as being an ancient Karl Barth, and he presents Clement as being a modern day comparison being Paul Tillich. And that is to say that they both kind of represent the prototype of a liberal versus a conservative theologian. Whereas Tillich, for example, tends to be more speculative like Clement, and Tertullian is more like Karl Barth in their approaches, and Karl Barth was very critical of philosophy. Tertullian, of course, made the famous quip, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" And this is where we see the sort of the division between the role of philosophy and the role of theology. And we've talked about this quite a bit on the show. We dedicated an entire episode to the modern perspective on faith and reason in the Catholic tradition. And then it's something that has come up time and time again in our study of church history. And really what it boils down to is that Clement is much more optimistic about the human mind's ability to discover truth, whereas Tertullian was more pessimistic, and he warns Christians not to study too much philosophy. And it's sort of out of this fear that philosophy will taint theology. And this is a theme that will come up time and time again, as we see, especially when we get into the Protestant Reformation and the Reformers rejecting the idea of faith and reason, rejecting the idea of faith or philosophy playing a role in faith. And so this theme of philosophy with theology will come up time and time again, but I think as far as Clement and Origen go, or as Clement and Tertullian go, that it's important to recognize that they're taking different approaches. And one of the interesting things is that Tertullian formulates the doctrine of the Trinity long before the official declarations. And he likely gets ignored on this point because of his defection to Montanism. Remember, we talked about Montanism in I think part 1 of this series. So if you want more on that, go check it out. But he basically defects to this sect, and it's kind of unknown as to why he does that, but because of that, his writings and formulations that are good on the Trinity are likely ignored because of that. And this is where we will get into this war on the Trinity, but part of that is because of Origen, who was also condemned a heretic. But much of the later developments of the 4th and 5th centuries are indebted to him. So it's important to, even though he's declared a heretic, it's important to cover him. He's likely a pupil of Clement of Alexandria, so he's following this school of Alexandria that is again more speculative, more philosophical in its approach. And one of the positive things that Origen did was that he allowed for more educated Romans to take a more positive view of Christianity. But again, his teachings on the Trinity likely lead to the eventual clash in the 4th century. And so it's like a double-edged sword. It's kind of, on one end he does some good, and on the other end he does some bad. He argued against Celsus, remember, the pagan skeptic, and he really makes it impossible for Christianity to be a mere folk religion. So basically, Origen makes it so that Christianity has to be taken seriously, that it has to be taken for more than just another mystery religion or another personality cult. And there were two main heresies of Origen: the idea of universal reconciliation with God, so kind of an ancient view of saying that everyone gets saved eventually, and the idea of pre-existent souls, which he borrows largely from Greek philosophy, from Plato, and even though in principle he does set down this idea that any philosophical musing has to be subordinate to Scripture. He does set down those things, but in practice he doesn't do that, and it's ultimately, again, his musings on God and the Trinity that caused the war of the 4th and 5th centuries, which we'll get into next week. And then finally we have Cyprian, and Cyprian is important, and Olson points out that many Christian histories will go through and kind of downplay him and leave him out of it. But what he's important for is his elevating the role of the bishop and tying it into the doctrine of salvation, so that we get the adage that there is no salvation outside of the church. There's no salvation outside of what is then the Catholic and Orthodox Church, or the Great Church as Olson calls it, because they're together as one. Remember, everyone is in full communion at this point. There's no division between East and West theologically at this point. And so this idea from Cyprian births the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox style of ecclesiology that we have today, where the bishop, the authority is placed in the bishops. And he ties salvation to baptism as well. And this is thought to be because of the experience of his own baptism. And he's the first to do that outrightly. And, he's the first to do it. I mean, in an outright sense. I'm sure that many before him have implied it, but he's the first one to take an explicit stance on this idea of salvation and baptism going together. And so we are indebted to him for giving us the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox style of ecclesiology. Now, I think it's important to say something about that, because as we get into the chapter where Christianity gets its act together, this is one of the things that Olson points out as being important, where you have really over the centuries, over what we've covered so far, we've seen that the bishops gain more and more authority. And that is really because of the heresies and the movements that are happening, that are challenging the Orthodox position, that are challenging right Christianity. And so there's a need to say that this bishop can settle this dispute because he is coming from that inner circle of the apostles. Remember, we talked about apostolic succession, and this is where it develops, is from the early centuries. And even from the early centuries, you see that the Bishop of Rome becomes needed to settle doctrinal disputes, and that's an important development for Christianity in the West. As we know, that becomes the Pope. So this is where you have the system coming into place, so that, and what it does is it allows for Christianity to get its act together. It allows for the creed to come about. It allows for the canon of the New Testament to be developed. And that was an interesting piece, and I've just jotted down some notes on it here. But it really, my notes don't do it justice. I really would recommend reading that section of Olson's book on the creed and on the canon of the New Testament, and he tells the story of how that comes together. So that really by 397, it's going to be declared by St. Athanasius, is going to list the New Testament canon, and it's really just affirming what has already been established. And he does talk a little bit about, there's of course the debate nowadays that, and we'll probably cover this later on, where, of course, certain books, being inspired or not being inspired, and really the reason for the rejection of, the canon develops in two parts. One, because of the Jewish council in the year, I believe it was in the year 90 AD, that settled the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Scriptures that we know, that come to us as the Hebrew Scriptures. And you have the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and that included what Protestants call the Apocrypha, what Catholics take as the canon, and Olson doesn't say much about this division right now, but we'll talk more about that when we get into the Reformation and we get into that period of church history. Because it ends up being important for understanding the divisions of the church. But so what we see here in this time period is that the Orthodox position comes together in the formulation of the creed, of the Apostles' Creed, what comes to us as the Apostles' Creed. And this is really about 200 to 250 that this is all happening. And we don't know the exact origins of the creed, but it is coming to us very early on, and I think that's important that it's coming to us very early. We have the apostolic Christianity that is handed down to us, and ultimately will build the church. And we see that the church comes together in a position where it can weed out heresy, because this develops the synodal system that we use today in the Catholic Church still. That comes about. That's in place as well. And so by the year 300, we see what is the system that's going to rule the Western Church for the next 1,000 years or so, until the Reformation is in place, and we will see that all that's needed now is the political backing to make it stick. And that's going to come about when the persecution stops in 313, when Constantine becomes a Christian, and we're going to get into all of that on the next program, on the next episode. And so we're going to take a quick break again, and we're going to come back and wrap everything together and discuss some of the practical implications for all of this history. So don't go away. and go tell it on the mountain, bringing us into this concluding segment and bringing us so that we can hopefully draw some present day applications and really what I want to get at is, why is this prolonged study of our history as Christians, why is it important? And I think it's important ultimately because what we see here is the development of the beliefs that we hold so dear today, of the Trinity, of the, we have the creed that we still say in our liturgies, in our places of worship. It essentially forms the bedrock for all of Christianity, whether it's Orthodox, whether it's Catholic, whether it's Protestant. All of it is indebted to this period. And really, you come to a place where you have to ask, was this something that was made up, or was it the truth? And ultimately, if you're like me, if you're listening and you're a Christian, you believe that this was the truth. And I think what you see from this period is that there was so much assaulting it from within and without that it ultimately, it's kind of like Tertullian himself says, that it's so absurd that it's true. And he kind of makes a couple of different claims like that, and he made that claim on the Trinity, which is basically saying that no man could have ever made it up. It had to have been revealed by God. And so really through this period you can sort of see the hand of God, really guiding the course of history, especially as far as the church is concerned. And you might not see it so much in my own ramblings here, but I would recommend that you read something like Olson's book, because you would see it there more so than in these conversations. And that's what I think is important, is that, in terms of seeing God's hand on history, we see it here, that this is truly the faith handed down from the apostles to the present day. That these are the guardians of the faith who maybe weren't always perfect, but they ended up forming the foundation, as we've talked about. And maybe this is a good place to conclude as we wrap up we're kind of getting to the end of the opening of the series, and we're seeing all these different characters come up and seeing them lay the groundwork for what we believe, and they end up going to their graves as martyrs. And so we owe them a debt of gratitude as Christians today. And you sort of see how the system of bishops and the system and the Pope and all of that becomes necessary to settle these doctrinal disputes. And so you get a sense of the history that leads us to where we are today, and how this history is still playing itself out and still influencing the modern world. And so it is my hope and prayer that this will go through and will nourish your faith, and will be a blessing to you in that our faith is not something that's in vain. It wasn't something that was pulled out of a hat, but that it is the truth revealed to us from God and defended through the centuries. And so that's going to do it here for this episode. Don't forget to join us next week when we talk about the dispute over the Trinity and the nature of Christ, and how that ultimately gets resolved. And I also would like to start that interview series, and hopefully we can get that off the ground within the next week or so. So don't miss it here, so then that will give us a way to cover it. We'll have the regular episode of covering a particular topic and theme, our theme being Christian thought and its development. And then we will hopefully have an interview, so we can discuss the contemporary happenings of the church, and hopefully fulfill the vision for this show as being one of providing the best in journalism from a Christian perspective. So, thank you to all for listening, and have a blessed week.